I'm Patrick Brady, Senior Vice President of Business Outreach at Tryon Direct, and welcome to everyone that's joined us from across the state. The peak for North Carolina continues to get pushed out, and that's a positive thing. Return to work planning is now underway for those who weren't fully operational up to now. But what does that mean for exposure to the virus, for risk to your business? Having a testing and mitigation strategy is what we've been talking about for the last week, and it's what we're going to focus on today as well. We want you to know what to expect, especially as you look to bring people back into the workforce. And we're going to be transparent on everything that we know up to now. And as you see in the media, every day there's news on testing that comes out, and we know that can be pretty daunting. So we're going to try and break that down for you here today. We highly encourage you as we go through today's discussion to ask us questions along the way. We welcome those. You can do it either in the chat or you can *6 if you are on the phone. Now, through our COVID-19 task force, which is made up of medical, business, employer, financial expertise, so we do these webinars twice a week. Tuesday, Thursday, 4:30 to 5:30. And then we have our website, tryondirect.com, which we'll put up at the end of the webinar today. So interact with us either of those ways, and let's make it an ongoing conversation between us. The agenda for today, as you see on your screen if you're in the webinar, Dr. Dale Owen, our CEO of Tryon Medical Partners and practicing cardiologist, is going to take us through what you need to know about the peak, the second wave, what it means for returning to work, what's going on with antibody testing, what are the testing options. We'll talk about contact tracing, all things that are up to the minute of what we know and want to share with you. On the call as well, we have Gaston Gage, our Chief Strategy Officer, Stephen Gage, PhD and organizational psychologist at Gage Benefit Advisors, Granger Pierce, labor attorney at Benoit, Reutlinger, Adams, and Pierce. Today's audio and the slides are going to be posted tomorrow, the 24th, and we're going to go through today's discussion. We'll have plenty of time for questions, both during and after, so please make this interactive with us. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Dale Owen.
Hello, Patrick, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, hello everyone, good to talk to everyone again. Have some news from the governor today, obviously extending the stay-at-home order through May 8th and starting to plan different scenarios in which to potentially go back to work, open up the economy, different phases of being able to do that. Very similar. I suspect we'll see that to be somewhat similar to what the president announced last week, and we'll see how that goes. But I think it's really smart that the stay-at-home order was lengthened. I think that we've already made a decision that we're going to prioritize the health of the population and and just general mankind and humanity, and treat that first and do the very best we can to decrease that risk of more spread and death and so forth, and then try to slowly thread that needle and open up the economy. As you know, each of the different states is going to have the ability to do it their own way, as long as they follow certain types of guidelines. And that's going to be really interesting to see as to whether or not this is successful. So with that, I harken back to what we've seen in the past, 100 years ago with recurrent outbreaks after those attempts, and also with Japan recently trying to open up their schools and seeing what happened to them with significant more outbreaks. So this is not going to be an easy thread of the needle. it's got to be very surgically done and very precise. We're going to have to see that there's a decrease in the cases rather than an increase. But there are still significant pockets across this state of significant flares and outbreaks. And we're seeing them. You all may be seeing them. We know it's being reported around other areas of the state. We know that Mecklenburg County is getting under much better control, and some of the initially harder hit counties are getting under better control. I think that what's really been missing, as we've talked about before, is the overall testing, because we're getting ready to enter into a process of opening back up the economy without the fund of knowledge we need to make that decision, because we don't know what's going on in the rural areas of the country and the state, and we don't have enough testing to know how many people are have already had the virus that might be tested by antibody testing. We don't know the significant volume of people that have this virus but no symptoms, the asymptomatic patients. So it's an educated guess. And from a pandemic standpoint, we have more information than any other pandemic has ever had in the history of mankind, but it's still not enough to be able to make the type of assessments we are hoping to make. But we're going to make the best guess at it with the information that we do have. And that's the best we can do unless suddenly testing was so readily available that everybody could have one. With that, I want to go into slide 2, I believe it is, looking at the growth of outbreak. We have, as of the today at 1 p.m., there are 843,000 cases reported in the United States, and cases are significantly increasing still here in the United States. The rate of increase, though, has decreased. I would like to see the number per day start to decrease significantly and actually get past this peak significantly to be able to decide to open things up. There is a lot of heated debate you see it on the TV, different stations and so forth, such as Las Vegas opening up its casinos, and then mayor saying that not her responsibility to have the ability to police the 6-foot distancing, that the casinos themselves will do that. So, that seems to me like that's going to potentially be one of the hot spots coming up. So I want to give folks another round of understanding about this antibody test that is now going to be more available. The antibody test, as you remember, is a blood test related to evaluation of an antibody that a human being makes against an antigen, which is part of the virus. We want a specific antibody, a unique antibody, one that hopefully conveys immunity. What we do know is that this antibody, this IgG antibody test, can be positive while also having the PCR test being positive while still shedding virus. We know there's some overlap. There's not enough testing out there yet to know the degree of overlap, but that is ongoing, which means that you could have an antibody test that's positive, suggesting immunity, yet the person still has active viral shedding going on late in the course of the viral illness. So, not a good thing. We also know that the antibody test is much more helpful when it is used in where there's high concentration and incidence of the virus already. So when you have 30% infection rate in a population, you're going to have a much higher number of people test positive for the antibody than when you have a 3% infection rate in a rural area. So antibody testing is more likely to be much more significantly effective and helpful for companies with large incidence of infection in their area. The last part is, and probably the most important part of this antibody testing is, does it really convey immunity? Not every antibody is an antibody that will kill a virus. Some of them simply bind to and try and affect the virus. All antibodies are not deadly to a particular virus. We hope this one will be, and we hope that it will last in the memory of our immune system memory banks so that it is ready to attack the COVID virus if it sees it again. We don't know that yet. That's going to take some time to determine. So the antibody test, although great to have, is somewhat limited in our armamentarium and our war chest or our weapons to be able to determine what's going on with COVID-19. Still, the PCR blood test, not blood test, the PCR test, polymerase chain reaction test, it's the nasopharyngeal swab, is still the best out there. There is a saliva test that we've talked about before. It's also a PCR test. They did recently test 60 people who tested positive by nasopharyngeal swab, and the same 60 then were tested by saliva, and there was a 100% match between the two, such that all the saliva samples also revealed positivity for COVID-19. What we don't know from that is how far along the patients were in their viral illness and how much viral load they had at the time, or were they asymptomatic early in the phase. We don't know if the saliva test can capture people at the earliest phases like we know the nasopharyngeal swab can. So some more data coming out. We hear that Quest is working on that platform to be able to use the saliva test. There are others in the country that are touting a saliva test, but not a scalability yet. The original saliva test that was approved by the FDA during emergency use was out of the New Jersey area with Rutgers, and it was primarily being used in the state of New York and New Jersey, contractually helping that area first and foremost. And I would love to see that saliva test become more available and scalable with a reputable lab. So more on that. Hope to have that to you by Tuesday after we talk to Quest and other the labs after getting that information today. So we also know that there are now home tests for individuals that are being made available. LabCorp mentioned that earlier in the week, and whether or not this is really going to be helpful for a company is somewhat difficult to say, because it is felt still needed to be done appropriately. There are some companies that are suggesting that a video also accompany that home test to know how to do it right. I'll tell you that in our COVID-19 satellite clinics where we do nothing but test for COVID-19, we have our physicians or nurse practitioners, our trained staff to do the test. They've done hundreds before they are sent out to the public to do them elsewhere. So I still wonder how accurate that's going to be looking at a video one time as an individual. So quality control, obviously an issue. I do want to go into the concepts of what we're going to do in regards to phase 1, 2, and 3. Obviously, phase 1 is where we are now. We're using PCR testing of different types, mostly nasopharyngeal. The second phase is when we're starting to go back to work, and we need a mitigation strategy. Who can go back to work? Some employers want to do a baseline PCR testing across their group of employees to know who's PCR positive and negative to begin with. That's a very good foundation and allows you to know who's positive, get them out of that community of employees, and get them quarantined, and then everybody else who's PCR negative could potentially go back to work. That allows you to start with a baseline of 0 rather than an unknown baseline. So, given that, the next option would be possibly antibody testing. And there again, it's going to depend primarily on how effective it really is and whether or not you're in a hot spot. And there are some employers that are also interested in considering, and we think it's a good idea, starting to recommend this as soon as everybody starts getting back to work and so forth, is whether or not to do antibody testing and PCR testing in combination. Because the people who are antibody positive, if they are also PCR positive, that tells you they can't go back to work because they're still shedding the virus. So sometimes a combination of things can also help. But knowing what your baseline rate of infection is, removing those infected by PCR testing before people go back to work is very, very helpful. Starting with a baseline of 0 infection as best you know by PCR, it's much easier to manage a positive test or a person who comes on with a new symptom than it is to manage a baseline that you don't know how many people are infected and one pops up.
Dale,
One pops up, yes.
sorry, we typically get a fair bit of interaction at this point. We already have a question. Might be good to field this now before you go on. At the point the employee tests positive for COVID, isn't it too late for coworkers? The exposure's already occurred.
Okay, so the exposure has occurred. But if you know, from a limited standpoint, I'll go back to knowing what your baseline is. If you know what your baseline is of 0 to start with, because you've done PCR testing across your organization, let's say 100 people, 6 were positive, you removed them. Or 3 were positive, you removed them. You now start with a baseline of 0. That then allows you to be much more surgical, have a much greater surgical approach with PCR testing, hotspot mitigation, because when one person pops up of the remaining with new symptoms, it is much easier to attack that one spot than to have allowed those 3 to 7 before to have been there long term. You have much more surgical precision in being able to take on the one case and get the others around them out of there, get them all tested again, and find out where the spread has occurred, if any. But this is also, remember, you're doing a bunch of different things at the same time. You're masking everybody. They are likely wearing gloves. You're doing social distancing. You're also checking their temperature on a daily basis, along with symptoms. You're asking about what's going on in their family. Has anyone else started having a fever? Those are the types of things that, when asked and looked at, gets you these patients at a much earlier stage where their risk of having spread the infection is markedly less. So we're being much more proactive than we were before. I hope that answers the question. It's not that the whole place is infected at that point, but it could be if you will start with a baseline. That's the key. Start with a baseline that's negative by getting all the positives out. Then you can do the right tracing. You might find that one of the 6 who was positive initially has a brother that's negative so far. But okay, and if they've been spending a lot of time together, living in the same house, you're probably going to remove the brother also. Even though they're PCR negative to begin with, you could still have a false negative for several days. You might retest them again. So there's lots of different strategies to be able to pick at little pieces of where problems erupt. And all of these are weapons in your armamentarium to do so. And you have to use all of them. One thing by itself is not going to solve this for anyone. It's not just PCR. It's not just social isolation or temperature testing or masks or any of it. You have to employ all of these at the same time.
Dale, let's go one step further, and I'm going to keep an eye on the chat because usually we pick up with questions about at this point in the conversation. Let's go one step further. Let's say there is no baseline. Let's for a minute talk about what happens if there is infection within a site, a plant, whatever it might be. How does that look? And I asked Dale because we see it, unfortunately, and baseline is Dale's proactive explanation. Dealing with after the fact infection is much different. So Dale, you take us through that.
Yeah, that's a reactive situation without a baseline, and it's harder. It's much harder because you don't know how many people are infected. The only way you can find out how many people are truly infected is to do a baseline. But let's say you haven't done a baseline first, and now you've got one positive, then another positive, maybe a third positive. Uh-oh, somebody else has some symptoms. Well, where there's smoke, there's fire, and you know that you've got more going on than what you initially thought. You may have done absolutely everything right by CDC guidelines. I mean, 100%. But this virus doesn't care. It doesn't care about CDC guidelines. It doesn't care about you. It doesn't care about me. And it doesn't care about what we think. It is pi. It is a constant. It does what it does. We are the variables in this process. To eliminate as many variables as possible is sometimes hard and can be expensive across a large organization to do a baseline at that time. So what would you do? You would follow all the guidelines. You would do massive tracing of those individuals who are positive and find out where else they might have been infected someone else. You're going to know what their habits are, who they go and see, who they eat lunch with, where they eat lunch, who their relatives are that might be working in the same couple of buildings. Do they live in the same house together? Have they been seeing each other a lot recently? And all of those things, all the societal things become very, very important to be able to make decisions. And so if you have a very tiny outbreak and no symptoms anywhere else, and you feel like you've done an incredible search and tracing, and you've monitored everybody's temperature, everybody's wearing gloves, and you've done a phenomenal mitigation effort, you could potentially leave it like that. Remove those people. But if you have close quarters and people using common restrooms, lunchrooms, water fountains, desks, tables, so forth, people moving in and out of different offices, buildings on a site, and so forth, you got to play detective. And you've got to, well, it's kind of like thinking like a physician. In other words, you sniff it out. And what's my suspicion? My suspicion is that there's more going on, and we've got the tip of the iceberg or the tiger by the tail, whichever analogy you like. And I need to know whether or not there are more infected here that I don't know about because of conditions in the plant. But nothing that you've done wrong, but just the reality of human behavior. That's when you would do your PCR testing on baseline. And we hope every single time it's zero beyond what you've already identified. That'd be great. Everybody wants that for both humanity, the individual, and for the company. But if you've got positives elsewhere, you know you have to act. That's how I would answer that.
Anybody else want to jump in with a question on the phone, in the chat? All right, no more questions at this point.
So I don't want this to go on as long as others have in the past. I think that where we are now is, I think people have a pretty good understanding of tests. I'm happy to answer later at any time, email, what have you, about tests, if there's any other confusion. I think that the issue is going to be timing now. When do we start to open things up? How quickly? Which portions of the economy do we open up first? I will tell you, every time in the last pandemic, when the states opened up schools, we got crushed with more Spanish flu. When Japan opened schools last month, they got whacked hard. And I think it's pretty easy to see why. You've got a large population, tight quarters, and not necessarily concerned about their own hygiene because they're invincible, as we all thought we were. And it becomes a major gasoline on the fire to fan this flame of the virus. So I suspect that schools, from the traditional standpoint of teaching in classrooms and dorm rooms and things like that, will be one of the last to open. I'm hoping so, based on, even though I've got 2 kids at home from college, and sometimes that's not pretty. The fact is that we're probably getting a lot better at virtual teaching, and let's be safe about that in regards to putting the kids back in. But we do want to remember that if we don't do this right with getting on the backside of the peak of this curve, and we open too early, there are going to be tens of thousands of people with this virus still who are asymptomatic or minimally symptomatic, who don't know they have it, and they're just going to spread it right back again. It has to be a slow opening. And we can't be hasty. And we can't just want to do it because we want to do it. We got to be really methodical about opening, or we're going to get a second peak that may be larger than the first one. And if you go back and look at the Spanish flu, it had 3 peaks to it. Spring of 18, fall of 18, and spring of 19. And the worst was the fall of 18. And we tried very desperately to get back into the workplace. Now, the overlying thing that really blows that data apart, that we may not be able to use it as sufficiently as we would like, to predict things is World War I was going on then, and we had all these troops that were all together and so forth. And there was no question that had a significant impact on it. So it was a real massive compounding variable that may prevent us from being able to know exactly how to open things up. I am happy to see that the governor pushed it out at least another week. And, you know, it's a day-to-day thing to see how well we're doing at blunting this peak and getting past the peak and so forth. I know there are other outbreaks occurring, and hopefully we're not going to identify many more and be able to open things up slowly.
Dale, here, I'll field this question. The question is on the chat: as an employer, should we have a deep clean of the office area before employees return to work? This question, thank you for that, is one that we get in conjunction with others. And it is, how do you maintain or set up a safe workplace when you come back after returning to work? We have put together a document that can help walk you through things to think about. Let us send that out to you. I think it will be helpful. It combines everything that the CDC puts out, but also just some practical things that we've talked about with employers when we have individual conversations. So we will get that out to you so you can have that. Any other questions? As Dale said, this is meant to just be updates to you. It's not one that we have to go a full hour today. So I'm going to encourage people, if you do have questions, to jump in. If not, that's fine. We'll give you time back here in your afternoon, but don't want to ignore anybody that wants to get some questions answered. Anybody on the phone? So *6 or in the chat. Let us know. Okay.
So Patrick, I want to actually answer that question as well about the deep clean. You know, if you had absolutely unlimited funds and could do all the things that were possible, you'd PCR test every 5 to 7 days, which is unrealistic for most companies, the vast majority of companies. There are only a few that are just off the charts important to the fabric of the United States that would consider things like that, along with these other things, such as antibody testing, deep cleaning regularly, between shifts or on weekends and things like that, not knowing who's brought what in. And so you could implement all of these things that we've talked about and do it multiple times if you had an unlimited budget to prevent COVID-19 the best you possibly could. But you're still going to have something happen. Just about every employer is going to have something happen with COVID-19. And it's not because of the virus. It is because of human beings and the variability with which they are willing to do what is necessary and appropriate. Or not necessarily just willing, may not even be able to, may not have a social structure that, or a socioeconomic structure that even allows them to have significant social distancing at home or something. And so an employer will do everything they can. And I know you all will, ethically, morally, financially, do whatever's appropriate that you can possibly do. I get that. Everyone's going to have to be prepared for hotspot mitigation on the back end of opening up. It will happen. It's going to happen. And that's because we haven't eradicated the virus before we opened up. If we eradicated the virus beforehand, we wouldn't have any problem like that, right? But because there's still going to be significant virus out there, and people are quite variable in their habits and hygiene and socioeconomic living situations and so forth, it is going to rear its head again. There will be a second wave. That second wave and the height and the degree of it, the intensity of it, the death rate of it is going to be based on when we open up. If we open up too early, it's going to have a much greater effect. And making sure that all of the employers do everything possible with the temperature checks and symptom checks, masks, social distancing, all of these things, deep cleaning, all of this. So there's just so many variables. It's impossible for an employer to do everything possible and not have somebody slip through the cracks. But that slippage through the crack is the opportunity with a low baseline of infection to nip it in the bud.
Dale, I got a question for you. It's unrelated to this. I'll add one thing to what Dale's saying. Not only should you be thinking about deep cleaning before you return to work, what we talk to employers about is doing deep cleaning twice a day. And you'll see different numbers out there, but that is a daily thing. Now, wiping surfaces, so the 1 to 10 Clorox to water mix that you see, and our practice talks about that too, that is just an ongoing thing throughout the day. So it's not only deep clean coming back into the workforce, but then doing it repeatedly each day. So that's all in what I mentioned earlier, and we'll get that out to you. Dale, here's a question. This one comes up a lot right now, and it is around the notion of conveyance of immunity. So I get the virus today, I've had it, I test positive for it, or else I show up when I do an antibody testing. Can't I get it again? And we don't know how long before I could get it again, right?
Okay, so if you were confirmed to have had it, let's say by PCR testing, then what we don't know, because we've never seen this virus before, we don't know if the immune system reaction that we made to eventually eliminate the virus is something that we keep in our memory bank of our immune system. So there's these two antibodies, IgM, that fights the infection immediately, and IgG, by certain types of white blood cells, is the memory type of antibody. And that's what allows your body to fight off different types of viruses when it sees it again. So could you become infected again? Yes, but your immune system, if it made the right antibodies to convey immunity, it should destroy that virus quickly without causing significant infection once it sees it. It usually takes a day or two for that type of a memory antibody and white type of white blood cell to go through the process of regenerating itself, and it kind of goes dormant essentially. And then that dormancy ends when it sees the infection again. And then bam, it makes the immune system reaction again. So the conveyance of immunity is complex. It goes dormant. Then it strikes again when it needs to. What we don't know in this situation is how long does our immunity last from the antibodies made against COVID-19, because we don't have any data on it. We have no idea at this time. We are hopeful that it conveys similar types of immunity to other influenza viruses or cold viruses or things of that nature that we've seen in the past, but we don't know yet.
All right, anybody want to jump in with questions at this point? Chat? All right, Dale, I may let you give final thoughts and then I have something right at the very end. I know we're a little bit ahead of schedule, but that's fine. That's totally fine.
So my last thought is all about when we open, and that the virus is going to do its thing. Like I say, it's the constant pie. We are the variable. How we act, how quickly we open, how well we do our mitigation strategies and so forth in our offices and places of employment will dictate how well we stop this second phase or second wave. We are in charge of it. We need more testing to know data points, to know if we're being effective with things, to be able to employ a strategy and see if it works. We don't have that level of testing capability at this time. Hopefully we will soon. PCR is still going to be the hallmark of therapy. There may be a small place for antibody testing. We hope that the PCR testing will have significant scalability with the saliva test soon, so that it can be much easier to embark on that road and to deliver those tests faster, more efficiently, and across a very large population.
All right, Dale, thank you for that. And let me do one more check here. Anybody wants to jump in, go right ahead. Let's take a look, because I really want to go back to our website as we wrap up, just to say that is our way to support you. Here's what the website looks like for those of you on the webinar. And we are, because as Dale has talked about, there's so much interest in testing and being prepared and baseline and retesting and antibody testing. And we're doing that. As Dale has said in the past, we are supporting businesses like yours in doing that testing, whatever phase of that you believe you're in. And we're going to put more of that on our website, so you know exactly how to connect with us on it. I would just say, in parting, if you have a need, reach out to us through the website. There's a phone number. You can email us, whatever works best for you, and we will definitely help you. And the key, I think, for us is to do this quickly. You lose time, you also lose some control, and you also have an impact on exposure in any given site, work site. So please let us know how we can help you there. And I think with that, we will send out the follow-up document on things to do in the workplace to stay safe. And if there are no other questions, I believe we'll give you 15 minutes back in your day. Dale, thank you for your information this afternoon. We hope everybody have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.